Jai Shri Radhe Shri Vallabhadhish ki Jai, Shri Gosai Ji Param Dayal ki Jai, Jai Shri Krishna Sab Vaishnav ko. Continuing with part 1 of the first of the 252 Vaishnava Varta, the story of Nagaji Bhat. First of all, Nagaji Bhat approached Sri Acharya Ji for holy name initiation. Then Sri Gosai Ji instructed Nagaji Bhat thus: Nagaji, go to my son Sri Gosai Ji and receive the holy name from him. Bhav Prakash. Why so? Because Nagaji Bhat is related to Sri Gosai Ji's form. He was destined to have greater affection for Sri Gosai Ji. Thus, Sri Acharya Ji instructed him, go to my son and receive the holy name from him. And the second reason was that Sri Acharya Ji would soon become an ascetic, and he would have the tradition carried on by his descendants. This is why Sri Thakurji had instructed him to marry. Considering all of this, Sri Acharya Ji sent Nagaji Bhat to Sri Gosai Ji. Here the doubt may arise: Sri Acharya Ji's eldest son, Sri Gopinath Ji. Why did Sri Acharya Ji not send Nagaji Bhat to him? The answer is, Sri Gopinath Ji is the avatar of Sri Baladev Ji, who adheres to the path of lawful limitations. He is greatly inclined towards performing spiritual practices. Sri Gosai Ji would lead the path of grace in the future. He would be the one to spread this path of grace. For this reason, Sri Acharya Ji offered the Pushti Marg souls into the care of Sri Gosai Ji. The main vessel of the Pushti Margi philosophy is Nagaji Bhat. So Sri Acharya Ji sent Nagaji Bhat to Sri Gosai Ji. Thus Nagaji Bhat became Sri Gosai Ji's first servant. Just as Sri Acharya Ji Mahaprabhu Ji's first servant is Damodar Das Harsani, in the same way Sri Gosai Ji's first servant is Nagaji Bhat. Part 1 continued. Nagaji Bhat went to Sri Gosai Ji and offered his humble request. Then Sri Gosai Ji had mercy on him and gave him holy name initiation. Thereafter he gave him Brahma Sambandh, the second initiation. Nagaji Bhat became a vassal of Sri Gosai Ji's grace and an accomplished devotee. Nagaji stayed with Sri Gosai Ji for several days and then he returned home. Sometime later, the time came for Nagaji Bhat's daughter to get married. The Vaishnavas of Kambhaich heard about it. Those Vaishnavas were disciples of Sri Gosai Ji. They gathered some wealth amongst themselves and wrote in a promissory note, folded it to conceal it inside a letter, and sent it with the messenger from Kambhaich to Nagaji in Godara. In the letter, those Vaishnavas wrote to Nagaji, "This wealth is for your daughter's wedding. Please make it a grand occasion." The messenger brought this letter to Nagaji Bhat's home in Godara and gave it to him. After reading it, Nagaji Bhat thought to himself, "It is not at all appropriate for the wealth given by these Vaishnavas to be used for a wedding. This is not my idea of the righteous path. I shall give my daughter in marriage to a poor Brahmin. This wealth belongs to Sri Gosai Ji, and it would be better for it to be given to him." Bhav Prakash. Nagaji was a householder, therefore it was not right for him to use the wealth of others. Vaishnava's wealth always belongs to Sri Thakurji, therefore Nagaji did not want to use it for worldly purposes. Part 1 continued. Nagaji wrote a note confirming receipt of the funds and sent the messenger back to Kambhaich with it. He went to a gold dealer and purchased gold coins from a gold dealer and came home again. He took a bamboo pole and, after making it hollow, filled it with the gold coins. Nagaji dressed up as a cloth dealer and, carrying that stick in his hands, travelled from Godara to Gokul in order to have the sight of Sri Gosai Ji there. Sri Gosai Ji became aware that Nagaji was on his way to see him. On the way there was an old lady Vaishnava living in a village who was one of Sri Gosai Ji's disciples. Sri Gosai Ji revealed to her in a dream that one of his disciples, Nagaji Bhat, would soon be coming there dressed as a cloth dealer. He told her to keep Nagaji Bhat in her home and feed him for 3 days, making sure that she fed him with sakari prasad. That very night, Sri Gosai Ji told Nagaji in a dream that the next day he would meet a certain lady in a certain village and that he should stay in her home for 3 days and accept sakari prasad from her. In the morning, the old lady arose and began her seva, cooked and made the offerings to her lord. After the correct amount of time, she accepted the offerings as prasad, made her Sri Thakurji comfortable, put the prasad away, came outside and stood there. In the afternoon, Nagji found himself on the outskirts of that very village and stood on the path. He was worried about going to an unknown house without an invitation. Standing on the same path, the old lady was also worrying about whether the Vaishnava was coming. They were both anxious until she saw him from afar. Full of devotion and love, she approached Nagji Bhat. She affectionately greeted him with Jai Shri Krishna. Later on, she explained to Nagji Bhat how Sri Gosaiji had instructed her to invite him to stay in her home. She asked him with great respect and then brought him to her house. Nagji Bhat realized that this was the lady from whom Sri Gosaiji had ordered him to take prasad. However, a doubt arose in his mind as to how he could accept Sakari prasad from her. Bhav Prakash. The reason for this doubt was that Nagji was a Gaud Brahmin by caste, and he was considering caste divisions. In the Leela, this old lady is a Sakhi of Sri Chandrauli ji named Bahula, who had a very simple nature. She is therefore very dear to Chandrauli ji. At this time, Nagji was not aware of her identity, and so had not recognized her heart, hence his doubt. Part 1 continued. Then the old lady invited Nagji to bathe. He replied that he did not intend to accept Sakri Prasad from her. She said that he should only eat what he pleased, but that he should have a bath anyway. Nagji did just that. She then served him with prasad of the Anasakri and Dudgar types, and he partook. He then announced that he was going to take his leave, but the old lady reminded him that Sri Gosaiji had told her to keep him in her home for 3 whole days. Nagji stayed for the 3 days, but only partook of Anasakri Prasad. After this, Nagji took his leave of her and proceeded to Gokul to have the holy sight of Sri Gosaiji, Bhav Prakash. The question here arises, why did Sri Gosaiji insist on his staying there for 3 days? Answer. Up until now, Nagji was not able to recognize the Vaishnava's true form. By making him stay for 3 days, the idea was to let him become aware of the extent of a Vaishnava heart. Therefore, he ordered Nagji to stay with her for 3 days. Sri Gosaiji had also instructed him to partake of Sakari Prasad from her hand. This is because Sakari Prasad represents deep affection. When one has deep affection for a Vaishnava, they should offer them Sakari Prasad. The old lady had deep affection for Vaishnavas. Sri Gosaiji wanted to grant Nagji the experience of this through her. Thus the order for him to take Sakari Prasad from her hand. In 3 days the experience should have been established in his heart. There is another reason too. For the sake of the old lady's heart, Sri Gosaiji told Nagji to share Sakari Prasad with her for 3 days, thus fulfilling her heart's desire. However, Nagji was not yet aware of this, so he only partook of Anasakari Prasad for those 3 days. Part 1 continued. On the day that Nagji was to arrive in Gokul 4 hours before, Sri Gosaiji announced to the Vaishnavas gathered round, "My Nagji should arrive today." He then bathed and dressed in his dhoti and uparana and sat on his upparas seat. At that moment Nagji arrived, and having the vision of him as the Lord bearing a conch and discus, bowed low before him. Sri Gosaiji asked him when he had arrived. He replied that he had only just arrived. Then Sri Gosaiji asked him, "O Nagji, with which Vaishnavas did you stay during your journey? Where did you take prasad?" Nagji replied that he had stayed with one old lady for 3 days and had partaken of Anasakari Prasad. Hearing this, Sri Gosaiji asked him, "Why did you not accept Sakari Prasad from that lady who is one of my closest disciples?" Saying this, Sri Gosaiji turned his back on Nagji. The reason for this was that Sri Gosaiji had told him to accept her Sakari Prasad for 3 days in order that he might receive the blessed gift of firmly established love in his heart. He asked, "Why did you question my instructions? That old lady, because of you, did not have any Sakari Prasad today, and that is an offence." Sri Gosaiji was very unhappy, and so turned his back on Nagji. Part 1 continued. After depositing the pole containing the coins into the store, Nagji immediately went back to the old lady's house. She offered him some Anasakari Prasad. Nagji told her that he had come specifically to partake of Sakari Prasad. She was very happy and offered him some. Nagji stayed there and partook of Sakari Prasad for 3 days. Thereafter he took his leave of her and set back off to Gokul. He arrived there after some days and bowed low to Sri Gosaiji, who asked him where he had been for those 3 days. When Nagji told him that he had stayed in the old lady's house for 3 days and partaken of Sakari Prasad, then Sri Gosaiji became overjoyed. Bhav Prakash. Now Nagji had realized the true Vaishnava form, therefore Sri Gosaiji was glad. Part 1 continued. After this, Nagji stayed with Sri Gosaiji for 3 months, thinking to himself that he would wait until the auspicious time for his daughter's wedding had run over before he bothered to return home. He reckoned that if he were to go home now, he would be obliged to perform his daughter's wedding, and so he stayed back. So this is where we will conclude our reading for today. Day 2, Varta 1. And we will continue tomorrow with the story of Nagji Bhat. Sab Vaishnavan ko Sadar Saprem. Jai Shri Krishna. Shri Vallabhadish ki jai ho. Shri Gosaiji ki jai. Shri Govardhan Dhara ki jai. Jai Jai Shri Radhe.